Okay, it's 1 minute after 3 o'clock, so we're going to get started with our final presentation for the afternoon. If you haven't heard of Pat McNeal or you don't know who he is, I think you'll find him to be a very, very interesting person. We've been talking about plants all day, but we are going to hear from an actual grower and somebody who's collected a lot of plants and grown lots of plants. Pat has been growing plants since the mid-'80s and probably before that. When we were opening the Wildflower Center, he was our consultant that helped us set up the entire growing operation and is largely responsible for the success of the Wildflower Center growing operation today. So he has a nursery, McNeal Growers, and instead of me just going on and on about what a genius I think he is, I think I'll just have him come on up here. He thinks in ways that most people don't, and that's what I love about him. So please welcome Pat McNeal. How's that for a send-on?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
He's just a genius.
Can I stand up there? Dang. They look like they got nice chairs. What did they spend on this? Millions, right? It was something crazy. We got a bunch more, and we're going to spend some more money. Can you all hear me if I don't use the microphone? If I just talk about it, because I hate standing in one place. I was watching a movie the other night, and it was Moses and the Egyptians. And they were walking around the palace. This is before Moses left. And he's walking around the Pharaoh's palace. And it's a beautiful palace. There's all kinds of vegetation and, indoor gardens and what have you. Because the Mediterranean climate's all open and really nice. And then by these big, giant doors, there's these two big old urns with sago palms in them. And I'm thinking, well, this is the same thing I see everywhere, is that people don't know anything about plants, because you would know if you knew anything about plants and sago palms from Japan. And when did the Egyptians ever get to Japan to get some sago palms? 3,500 years ago, to put them by the doors. And we see that a lot. You can watch old cowboy movies filmed in Arizona, and they say this is Texas, and there'll be something, some cowboy movie, and there'll be saguaro cactus, and they'll say this is El Paso, and you go, wait a minute. So, we don't really even, the world as a whole doesn't pay attention to those things very well, because the level of understanding it's easy to, that she goes, oh, well, it's not that. It's just that the bar is really low in this field for, all the botanists kind of don't get into horticulture. In fact, they're kind of, how do I grow when they're growing stuff for their research? They got these greenhouses they don't even know what pots to put them in or the soil. So the people who really know about pots are kind of siphoned out of the business. They don't really get into it. So that's kind of the way I approached it when I started doing, because I like plants, I like to look for them. I like to hunt them down and get seeds and just learn all about the plants here, actually anywhere, parking lots, cracks in the parking lots. I'm interested in what's growing why is it growing in that crack? Why is this little weed growing there? And that's really what I'm going to end up tying all this back to, why things are where they are. And if you understand that, then you can do landscaping. If you don't understand that, then you're just doing, agriculture. And one of the things, of course, all day, I better turn that off, huh? All right, you get to listen to 45 minutes of a lecture that I did. Hey, the organization of that is how we can get the potential out of these plants. I've been growing native plants, like Denise said, since 82, 83 or something like that. And I came here from California and kind of went, where's all the plants? When I went to the nursery, I was doing landscaping. I did that irrigation and stuff in California and came here. And I was like, I went to the nursery, where do they hide them all? I can't find any. The climate was so different. It's not harsh in California. It's just so easy to landscape there. They can grow anything. You can go to Chile, or you can go to Australia and grab their plants and they'll grow someplace. Not here. It's just too tough. But I started growing native plants because none of the plants that were normally available. I mean, this is a time when right down the street here there was azaleas growing on public land, and the guys were out there spraying chelated iron on there and sulfur and trying to keep the azaleas growing in these on the South First here, or Cesar Chavez. And when the university had a azalea walk in the springtime, and you could go on this tour and look at all the azaleas planted on they didn't have an idea of planting appropriately at that time, and neither did I. And I killed a lot of plants, and I still continue to kill lots of plants. That's sort of a given if you're growing plants. And I slowly learned about appropriate plants. But one thing it's important to know that the summation of all that learning is that nobody's ever proved that native plants actually don't use less resources. I mean, there's no papers or very few research or studies done that show native plants. We're just all assuming that that's the case. But we never realized that native plants realize that potential for resource savings, for saving water, for being less disease resistant. They only do that under certain conditions, which are the conditions they were adapted to as they evolved, which unfortunately is not a construction site that the soil's been all churned up and smashed and compacted and there's no original soil left, and that's what we deal with when we do landscaping. So what we have to do is select plants that will grow in that disturbed environment, and this is the epiphany I had, is because this whole area around a building is disturbed. That's literally why the weeds outgrow your plants that you plant. You plant a plant and the weeds, why is that? My weeds are this tall, all the ragweed is like this, and all the other stuff is like that, and I'm needing to fertilize it still. And the reason is there's different kinds of habitats that plants are adapted to. And until you know what those are, you're really not going to be able to solve those kind of problems. You're really not going to be able to get the plants to reach their full resource saving potential. They're not going to be drought tolerant. And I got to say, there's one guy that I've met in the nursery business that actually grows plants in a way that I would say that you could take them out of the pots, water them once, and they'd grow. You have to realize that as a grower, we grow plants in a fashion sort of like raising children on candy bars and milkshakes. It's unnatural, and we need to grow them to a certain size and sell them. They can't sit in the nursery for 3 years while we wait for them to grow. In fact, I don't know how the tree guys, I don't grow any trees or shrubs. I don't know how they get along with that, because you're putting $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 into these trees that take 3 years, and to me it's like, man, put it in the stock market or something. It seems mutual funds. It seems like you could make more money than waiting for your trees. You got to love trees to be a tree grower, because you put so much money into it without returning on your investment for 2 or 3 years, and then it's only dribbling in too. So you put $40,000 into half-acre trees. 3 years before you see your first dribbles of that, you're not really making the core of your money back for 4 or 5 years. And if we grew them so they would be native and drought tolerant, and it would be 5, 6, 7 years if you're talking about a 2-inch caliper city spec tree to go on a street or in a park. There's one guy at Los Politas out in California. He's the strangest guy one of the strangest guys. But he's a fairly odd person, but he believes that his plants can be put in the ground and only water once. And I've seen restoration jobs that he does, and it does work. But those are the punkiest looking plants I've ever seen. You have to know what you're looking at to realize what the potential of that plant's going to be. That plant is going to, that's going to turn into a western redbud. It doesn't look like it in his pot. It looks like this little teeny sprout, and it's going to take years to reach that potential, but it will be drought tolerant right out of the bucket. None of our plants are. So we have this period where you have to take care of them, and slowly condition them to meet those kind of conditions. The kind of extreme environment we have, droughts, overwater, floods, hail, late frost, snow, whatever, droughts. To meet all those kind of conditions, the plants have to be conditioned for that. In agriculture, that's where sort of humans started cultivating plants. We needed food. We realized it's too much trouble just to collect this grains randomly. If we threw some more seed on the ground, the stand is bigger. If we cleared all the other weeds away, they produce more grains. So what we eventually learned to do was to maximize and optimize the growth of those plants because we wanted a product from that plant. So for, who knows, 5,000, 6,000 years, that's pretty much what we did with everything. And one of the things that, to do that, one of the things that we do, or people in agriculture do, is that they're not so concerned about, their goal isn't saving resources. Their object is produce as much output with as little as input as possible. But depending on what the price of, say, the grain is, the commodity price, or what they're getting for corn syrup from their corn, it may be worth it to put a lot of money into fertilizer and water and blah, 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 so they can produce a lot of bushels of corn. What we have to realize is that landscaping, taking care of this continuum from restoration to the vegetation around our houses, has a completely different goal. That's not our goal. We're not all racing to grow the biggest crop of acorns on our live oaks. So we have to look at that and say, well, what are we doing? What's the purpose of growing this plant here? Is it to grow it up as fast as possible? And is it to produce a giant acorn crop? And of course, we got to look at that and say, no, of course it's not. And this is the funny thing about landscaping, is that the city offers ideas about this, and everybody offers put trees to shade your house. So they want trees to grow fast, but of course we want them to grow fast for the first 15 years and then stop growing. And that's not very logical, because that's not what they're going to do. They're going to grow pretty much at the same rate. They may get a little older, more mature, and slow down a little bit, but they're just going to keep growing. They're not going to go, well, now that we've shaded your house, we're going to stop growing. So we also put expectations. In fact, that's my job when I'm in, and all of us are doing this. We manage our clients' expectations about what we're doing for them so that we produce something that is in line with their expectations. So if the plant freezes to the ground in the wintertime, they don't freak out and go, where's all my plants that I just paid for? You know, they have expectations like that. Well, I thought it was going to bloom all year. And it's like, well, you know, things don't bloom all year. They bloom for 2 months or 3 months. And they had someone say the other day, well, how come your plants don't look like the ones at Home Depot? And I said, I didn't even answer, really. It's too long a discussion of saying, well, they got greenhouse, they bring them out of state, you know, and they're going to be dead in 2 weeks. So it's managing those kind of expectations, because those expectations are built on assumptions that we sort of assume about, again, back to agriculture, about how we take care of plants. And when you move the goal from production, maximizing production for a crop or a commodity, to I want to create a stable plant community around this park or around this subdevelopment, around this house, then your goal changes. But we really haven't, in the public, we haven't really had that discussion. What is it? What is that goal? Of course, in some cases, it's to have a huge music festival on a lawn. You know, that's one. Some of it is to shade the streets, and some of it's to lower the heat island effect. And so there's some of those things that we have talked about, but generally we don't We don't talk about those on a macro scale, like a citywide scale, subdevelopment size scale. The reason that we don't is because there's really not enough knowledge that spread around enough that where you have enough people to actually have that discussion. Because it's a pretty detailed discussion. You have to understand the difference or the connection between the plants growing and the productivity of the soil where they're growing in. And that's an idea that is so complicated. I don't know that I've found anybody that's ever been able to tackle that. Bits and pieces of research, but really there's just little glimpses of that. I see research that says that in Africa, when elephants strip acacias, they let off ethylene gas, and then all the other trees around it lose their leaves. So there's some kind of signaling mechanism going on there, where the one tree is damaging and signaling the others. We don't have any idea of that range of complexity of what these plants do. I'll give you an example that I always use is, and I always mess this up. Humans have 26 chromosomes and about 35,000 genes. And that's in line with other mammals. Rice has only 11 chromosomes. You go, yeah, that's about right. It's not very complex, doesn't have brains, doesn't have a nervous system, doesn't have all the organs, doesn't have an immune system, doesn't have the same kind of complex circulatory system. If it's not that complicated, then what's it doing with 50,000 genes? It has more genes than we do. What are those genes coding for if we're not seeing what's in that plant? There's a complexity there that we've completely missed. Here's another one that I picked up the other day. They said a gram of soil, which is about a tablespoon of soil. They found some researchers found a new family of antibiotics in the soil. Some of you might have seen this. It actually made it to the news. But the thing that I picked up from it was the guy said, in a gram of soil, there's 1 billion bacteria. A gram of soil, a spoonful of soil has 1 billion. So what do you think a cubic yard? All right. I'll let the councilman deal with this. There's nothing down there. Business. Yeah. So anyways, how many bacteria in a cubic yard of soil, right? That's got to be way more than all the planets and suns in the Milky Way, right? I mean, that's got to be more than all the grains of sand on all the beaches and all in the world. And that's only a cubic yard, and there's just millions of cubic miles of soil. How many bacteria is that? And then you throw in nematodes, you throw in fungus, you throw in all these other organisms in the soil. This creates something far more complex than anything other. There's only one thing that's as complex, that's the oceans, because they have the same thing going on. You take a little cc of ocean water and actually look at it, and it's like it's a circus down in there. There's just little things. You go, I'm glad I don't drink that, but the funny thing is any other water you drink is just like that. It's just swimming with all kinds of stuff, even after it's been chlorinated. In fact, we're generally just a walking circus. There's more genetic material of the things living on us, in us, and around us than our own. So if you tried to separate the genetic material in a human body, more genetic material is going to be there from the organisms that live in you and on you than what you have in yourself and all your cells. So we're a traveling zoo. There was 600 or 700 organisms just in your gut. There's like mites that just live in your eyebrows. Right? We have all these I mean, just there's different ecosystems in your whole body where different kinds of mites. So we don't even know the level of complexity of the interactions between the plants and the soil that they grow in. And the hardest thing is we've destroyed so much of that by rearranging it. In fact, grazing the grasses in the desert in, say, Southwest, Chihuahuan Desert, Mojave Desert, just grazing it once is enough to alter the soil in a way that it will never return back to that. I was lucky enough years ago to go plant collecting with Barton Warnock. Dr. Warnock was a professor, wrote a bunch of books on all the plants of West Texas, was one of the first guys to really study the plants in that area. And he was lucky enough to, when the Park Service decided it was going to eminent domain the Big Bend, which you can talk to people, it's like the Civil War out there in West Texas. When they eminent domain that and threw the people off, they were not happy. But he went out there and did plant surveys for the Park Service. And I would go out there, and this was 10 years ago, we'd drive around and he'd go, see all this thing? And it's just, if anybody's been on the drive to the north from Persimmon Gap down to the Chizos, it's just these big Tobosa flats. It used to be all grasslands, but it had been grazed by sheep. And it had been grazed, 100 years ago, before people really understood about, how much stock we can put and not destroy the vegetation. And, okay, so I go back there with him, and he goes, I remember in 35 or 33 or whenever he was down there, it looked the same. It hadn't recovered in 70 years. And since he passed away, the 20 years, it hasn't recovered at all. So there's no recovery from these kinds of disturbances. We don't know that what the complexity has changed and altered to something completely different. And you see that around here in the hill country where I see some remnant places where the hill country hills, there was a foot or two of soil on top of these hills. Until 1850s, I talked to some fellows out here who had continuously farmed an area out there north of Lakeway. Family had, and they said they cotton farmed it in the 1850s, the hills. They cleaned out all the grass because it was mostly grass, and they cotton farmed the sides of the hills because that was the time when the English just started using water wheels to produce looms, water wheel powered looms, and they'd gone from people, spinning and looming fabric themselves to having these great machines that do it, so they could use a lot more cotton. So the price of cotton and the demand for cotton went huge in the world for 3 years, and then it collapsed. But the problem was, when you plow those side hills, even once, and it rains, all the soil just a foot of soil, 2 feet of soil in some places. Some of the rates of soil accretion in the Midwest are like an inch every 1,000 years. So talking about 20,000 years worth of soil. So those areas revert to live oaks, junipers, instead of whatever they were before. What I'm leading up to for this is that there's a complexity of organization, like I said earlier, that if you understand it, then you can look at the landscape and it tells a story about what it was, what it is, and where it's going to be. And this is sort of the great thing I had the opportunity to do was go with a great botanist who lives here in town, Bill Carr, and he took me around and showed me all these new park properties. The legislature had changed some bills, added smoking tax or something like that so they could use that land to buy parks land. So they bought all those parks. They bought Kickapoo Canyons, caverns, they bought Devil's River, they bought Big Bend Ranch, Franklin Mountains, all these huge properties, but they needed someone to go assess them to find out where to put the parking lots and the sewer drains and the water lines and all the infrastructure. Well, they didn't want to put that on critical areas. So they had archaeology crews. They had Bill. This is how They had 2 or 3 archaeological crews go out and do this. They had 3 or 4 survey crews. One lonely guy do the botany for hundreds of thousand acres. That's our priority. So that we don't put roads and baseball diamonds and other utilities that we build in parks, campgrounds, on critical areas. But I was lucky enough that he drug me along with that, and I learned about the very beginnings of that organization. That if you look at Austin and you walk up Walnut Creek, or you walk up Barton Creek, 80% of the plants are going to be the same in both creeks. There's going to be little bits of difference. In different parts of the creek, there's going to be a little bit of difference. But for the whole, those things are going to be fairly same because the same conditions occur that mean that certain plants are going to be more competitive than others. And what this means is that under certain conditions, some plants are going to be like frostweed, more competitive than any other plant. And so the organization is based on the plants, these groupings, these plant communities, that they are the most competitive plants in that habitat. They use water the best. They're most efficient at using water. They're most efficient about growing fast under low light situations. And this would be under, say, in a creek bottom. They're more efficient at crowding out their neighbors. They're just basically better at growing under those conditions than anything else. And what happens is, we used to think that all this worked out in the Darwinian sense, that they were all fighting each other for resources. That there was this big evolutionary kind of process going on. There's survival of the fittest. They were all fighting each other for resources. And that actually turned out to be completely wrong. And that was the part about Darwin that, as far as plants go, is not even close to being correct. All these plants in a certain community have another thing that brings them together. And that's what's in the soil. The organisms in the soil also evolved with those plants. They've all grown together. They've all evolved together, and they've all become competitive together. So what happens is, in a lot of cases, those organisms are physically joined together. You have in, say, a woodland area, fungal mats that connect all these plants. You have, depending on what kind of fungus you're talking about, the fungus hyphae, the little things that go out, the little white little roots you see in duff or organic matter that's the part of the fungus, the main body, they'll actually penetrate the roots of a plant and grow into it. So there's a physical connection between these. So when you look at a live oak that has a 40-foot root system because it's 40 feet tall, or a pecan tree that's 30 feet tall and has a 30-foot root system because they're usually proportional, that pecan is pulling up water from 30 feet down. Well, the beautyberry next to it's got a 6-foot root system. How's it getting its water? It's because those two plants are sharing the same fungal net. Those plants can actually share water and nutrients between that. They're like the connection. They're like the piping. They're the plumbing system of the plant world. They actually connect those things. So we have all these beneficial organisms in the ground that work with the plants. So if you're not part of that group, if you're not hooked into that system, you're not going to be competitive. And that's why you look at, say, the prairies, and there's all kinds of weird excuses out there from range science why trees don't grow in prairies. They get burned or blah, blah, blah. Something happens. What happens is a seedling of a tree can't establish in those areas because it's in the wrong kind of a system. It can't plug into that soil type of organism so it can be get nutrients and water and all the other things that it needs that are unavailable any other way in that soil. So what happens is the grasses that do, and in grasslands, there's a lot less fungal mats, and they're bacterial mats. So you have to have if you're going to grow in a prairie, it's better off that you're a grass because you're evolved to need those bacterial mats to feed you. So that drives this organization. Why you see prairies and you don't see them just jumbled up. Well, you start to see that break down, though, as you go further east because there's not as much competition, say, for water. So if you go east, you start getting to where there's 30 inches of rainfall, 35 inches of rainfall. You see less grasslands and more interruptions of savannas. You see more woodlands, larger woodlands. They get bigger till all of a sudden at 40 inches there's no more grasslands. It's like if there's an opening, it's sedges, it's other species. It's not actually grasses. And then you can go any place in the world and see the same thing that happens. At below 30 inches, below 25 inches, you're going to see grasslands. If it's rocky and dry, it may not be grasslands, it may be brush. But all over the world, wherever you go, at 25 to 35 inches of rainfall, you're going to see predominantly grasses. Because in those areas, they are more productive and can outperform any other plants there, any other type of plants. Physiologically, they grow differently than woody plants. So that organization is, if you look at it, is then what we should transpose into a landscape. If you look at the way that nature is organized, it is giving us a format or a template that you don't have to learn that much. All you have to do is take every plant in that community and just move it over here if it's the same one. And every one of those plants will grow as long as you pick the right place. So this is why, you can't grow azaleas, because this is not the kind of area that you would find azaleas already growing. You would find those, of course, azaleas. I've seen them in Alaska, little baby, teeny ground cover azaleas, but it's acid soil. It's higher rainfall. So unless you have those conditions, you're not in an area that's going to support those kind of things. So like we grow plants, and we just see adapted plants that occasionally are brought from habitats that aren't suitable, aren't close enough to ours. So you see plants from Japan, you see plants from Chile, or you see plants from England. They don't grow here very well because they're just no way they can adapt to this environment. It's so much different. You can sort of fudge it with some plants and not with others. And within these organizational groups, they're not static. And this is the great thing about ecology that it's never really gotten applied very well and needs to get applied to horticulture. Because what ecology tells us is that you never really have a static situation. You have a certain plant community. Let's say you're in one of the creeks, or whatever this river used to be, the Colorado River. It used to be probably bald cypress, sycamore, pecan. Before it was dammed up, it was like any other river around here. You'd see those main trees and cedar elms and American elms, and you'd see all those kinds of plants. And you'd see those just about on if you go up the river, you'll see them on just about every river. And what you're seeing is a plant community is always, it's kind of like the idea of global warming. We've affected it, it started, but it's always been variable. It's never been, our climate of the earth has never been the same. And that's the way these plant systems are, is that they never static, they never stay the same. And especially along a river that might flood or dry up, you really got a lot of disturbance. So what ecology tells us is that there really isn't areas that always remain the same. They're always going back and forth. And so a good example of that, and an ecologist will say there are expressions of disturbance. So you got a river and it floods. We get 20 inches of rainfall from a giant low pressure system and it floods. It takes the plants out, changes the environment. It opens it up, and then what grows back there? More bald cypress and more sycamores? No, something completely different. Damn, everybody wants to talk at the end of the day. So what you have is a progression. Once you disturb an area, it goes back to the beginning. And it goes back to a different set point, and it has to go through these steps before it creates the conditions that were there originally. So in ecology, they call that succession. So you say you have a fire, that's a natural disturbance. You have a drought. All these things are natural disturbances. And what happens is it sets that finished plant community back to an earlier set point. And then it goes through steps till the conditions are recreated, till those plants that were originally evolved for that site are at the peak again. So what happens is you can go out to, you can see this really good out at Bastrop at State Park. Trees are all burned off. That was a climax, what's called a climax pine forest. It had reached pretty much the extent of what it's going to be. It was going to be loblolly pine, yaupon, and some of these other plants, post oaks, and then it got burned, and the trees are all gone. Then what comes up? Well, you have all these plants that now the physical conditions are different. So you're not getting loblollies, and this is the mistake that people are making, putting the loblollies back in there. You can't just go back and put loblollies in there. You got to go through these steps to create the conditions, because those loblollies don't like bare ground. They don't like not having the bacterial and the fungal mats in there. They're not going to be competitive against the other things like yaupon. Yaupon's going to take off like crazy in there. There's going to be some brushy species that you're going to have to go back and fight. This is something that I learned years ago, or saw years ago, and didn't really figure it out for 30 years. When I was working in pine plantations on the West Coast, they would go out and plant pine. They would clear cut. The Forest Service would allow a contractor to clear cut the forest. And then they'd go back and plant trees. Then 2 years or 3 years later, they'd have to hire another contractor to come in there, and that was me, with a chainsaw to cut all the brush out so the trees would grow. Because they created the optimal conditions for the brush, not the forest. Because they cleared all the trees away. So now the brush is going to be most competitive. So then we had to go cut the brush, which is essentially reducing their competitiveness so that the trees could grow. So when you're looking at a landscape and saying, why is the weeds getting bigger than my other plants, you have to do something to reduce their competitiveness, which is pull them, spray them, or do something, because otherwise they're going to overtake your other plants. They're going to outcompete them. So what you've done is you've changed the competitive relationship on that piece of land. And that's what we do when we create, say, a house lot, or you create any kind of construction site. You take and zero it off and go back to start over. So if you say, and this happened, when I did grassland restoration, you'd go back, you'd have a place that was, in subdevelopments, I work for a golf course company, and there'd be subdevelopments that go in and streets, and they'd say, well, we want wildflowers. Texas is known for wildflowers. Let's put wildflowers everywhere, and they think that's the solution because it's cheap. You just put out hydromost seed, and, it's $200 an acre, and then you got wildflower meadows, and everybody's happy. Well, it just turned into an ugly, weedy mess. For one season, the wildflowers kind of came up, and then you had one kind of wildflower, and then you had, all these other weeds that took advantage of it and came up. And what we didn't realize, or at least I didn't realize, and a lot of the other people still didn't, is that we created a condition for the weedy plants and it never changed. So it's always going to continually be things like Indian blanket and Mexican hat and things like that that love to have disturbance areas and don't like it, the transition to more stable vegetation. And so when we look at that, we have to figure out how do we take a lot like, say, this building that's all, basically set back to zero and create something that's going to be stable. Something that's not, because the biggest part of a landscape is going to be, after it's put in, is the manpower that goes into maintaining it. And if it's poorly done, you're going to have to replant. You're going to have to put a lot of manpower into it. You're going to have to add water, fertilizer, all these inputs into that because the landscape didn't get put in a way that made those plants competitive in the environment there are. And the hard thing is to figure out what that is that you need to do, what plants you need to start with to get the plants to be competitive against the other plants you don't want. So when you're doing a landscape, you're always, at least that's my idea, is that I'm looking for plants that I can make in that landscape, in that zero starting position that can be competitive against the plants that I know are going to come up there, no matter what soil, whatever the soil guy tells you that there's no weeds in my soil. Well, maybe. There probably is, and there's probably going to be a lot brought in on the tires of the wheelbarrows and the boots of the guys that are working, on the tires of the trucks, whatever. They're going to get there, they're going to take off, and eventually you're going to have nutsedge everywhere. And so what you have to do is create a plant system that outcompetes those. And let me give you one idea of something I learned. It's there's easy little tricks to understanding that. And one of the harder situations to do is I've done some stream bank and ponds and things like that. When water is not the limitation, everything grows. There's no limit to growth, right? So imagine Bermuda grass on the edge of a golf course pond. What's going to limit its growth? It's got all the water it could ever need. Okay. The only thing what plant is going to do better than that plant? There's one way that you can look at this and say, I know how I can beat that back. And there's one little thing to know. Tall wins. Whatever's taller is going to intercept the sunlight and win. So if you've got Bermuda grass that's this high, plant something 2 feet taller, and the Bermuda grass will disappear. So all you have to do, and that kind of, what I learned about that is, okay, what kind of sedges and what kind of plants that are just as competitive as Bermuda grass, but are a foot taller. Then I can get rid of the Bermuda grass. What can I put in there? If I've got nutsedge, what can I put in there that's 6 inches taller than the nutsedge and will shade it out? Then the nutsedge will get rid of. So what you have to do is those are kind of the easy things that you can sort of figure out, what can I do to take those things that I want and give them the competitive advantage against the things that I don't want. And so shade, which was effectively what you're doing, is putting a taller plant and shading out the lower plant. That's a pretty easy one to do. You can also get rid of nutsedge by just making sure that the soil is dry. Nutsedge is not competitive when the soil is dry. Nutsedge always grows in low clay swales. So if you got a low wet spot, then it's always going to have nutsedge. You plant something taller. But if you have nutsedge in a lawn or a yard, turn the irrigation off. Stop mowing. Then the grass will outcompete the nutsedge. So here's the other thing too, is that weeds, what I would call a weed in ecological terminology, they'd be early successional plants. The plants that come in when there's just nothing there, bare ground. Those are the weedy plants. They have some things in common that make them competitive to that spot. One of them is they like fertilizer. They love nutrients. So when you have an area that's tore up, a lot of organic matter gets into that soil in not so much in a construction site, but in a naturally occurring disturbance site. you have a lot of mixing of organic matter. That leaves a lot, and reduction of the plant material, the biomass. Then you have nothing using up all that compost. Then you have those plants feeding heavily and growing faster, like ragweed, growing faster than anything else. So if you have those kind of weeds that have to have freely available nitrogen to grow, or freely available phosphorus or whatever, potassium, don't fertilize, because that reduces their competitive advantage. Because an oak tree doesn't need fertilizer. If the soil is in good condition, it's making a trade-off with the fungal mat, the glomus and the vesicular, arbuscular, whatever, I can't even remember the names anymore. But these things that they are connected to, they have a relationship where the fungus, it exudes enzymes that takes nutrients and liquefies them out of the soil, makes those nutrients available to the plant. The plant then feeds the fungus with sugars and minerals and stuff that it produces by photosynthesis. So they're locked together. One gives them the raw material, the other one gives the other one the made materials from its photosynthesis. Fungus can't photosynthesize. So they're dependent on plants to do that for them. Or they live off the decaying other plants. So they have that trade-off. That's the way they get fertilized. They don't need fertilizer put on the ground. In fact, a friend of mine who sort of taught me this has a company called Trees That Please in Las Cruces, or not Las Cruces, but Las Lunas in New Mexico. And they're doing stuff with this, they're doing cotton fields, they're doing forest fire areas, they're treating the soil with these various micronutrients or microorganisms all over the Southwest, because that's what the soils are lacking. They've been, overgrazed, they've been under drought conditions, they've had many problems, they've been forested, so the soils are very depleted. So what they do is they're building the soils up by building up these biological mats. And that's what will eventually happen with these trees in a landscape. They don't, at that point, you don't even have, like he was telling me, he grew trees like that in pots where he inoculated them. He doesn't fertilize them anymore. What he just does is adds the raw materials so the fungus can turn that into fertilizer. You don't have to put regular fertilizer on there. You just put the bulk organic matter on there, and they convert that to fertilizer. If you do that in a landscape with a plant from a nursery, like what I grow, that's going to take a long time, because in a lot of cases you're not going to have the soil organisms that are going to convert those organic compounds to something soluble that the plant can use. But the thing is that those early successional weeds, they never can do that. They're always going to rely on a quick dose of liquid fertilizer, some kind of soluble fertilizer that's in the ground. So after a fire, you have organic matter that's burned up, not entirely burned up, so that there's still some organic matter left in it, and it's liquefied, rain runs through it. That feeds those plants, and it gives them a huge burst of fertilizer. They grow under those kind of conditions. But most of our landscape plants, they don't need that. They'll eventually have a relationship with the soil where they're going to get all their nutrients. And that's the kind of thing, if you wonder why in Zilker Park the trees are not doing well, the grass is not doing well, one thing is grasses and trees don't normally grow together. Live oaks don't normally grow with any kind of grasses underneath them. They're not a savanna tree, they're a woodland tree. So the thing that would grow around a live oak would be other trees. But if you put them in grasses, you're setting them to fight against each other. They're not growing. They're not going to grow cooperatively, and that's what these plant communities do. If you go into Barton Creek, it's going to be it's mostly going to be classified like sycamore, bald cypress bottomlands. And that's sort of the Parks and Wildlife has come up with 30 or 40 different plant communities that you find, general plant communities. And that's how they would categorize that. And each one of their subdivisions lower and lower. You wouldn't find Bermuda grass in that community. You know, it would be in a grassland community. If it was native to this area, it'd be growing up in the high plains natively with buffalo grass and blue grama. It wouldn't be anywhere near Barton Springs. So when you put those two together, you're going to have conflicts that one treatment is going to help one and one's going to help the other, but they're never going to do anything that helps both. So you're going to always have that conflict. So when you do a landscape, you want to make sure that all the selections you make are not conflicted. And so that's the idea of if you've got a woodland system, if you're in the center of town and you got deep soil, you got 6 feet of soil, you're over by the I-35 and the old airport, there's magnolias growing over there, there's walnuts. That's deep-rooted areas, deep soil above the limestone. Those have a completely different set of plants than you would see on the west side of town and on the other side of Mopac. Those plants really don't do well when you move them. If you move Sinisos over here to the east side of town, they really don't do well. They do as well as any non-native plant because they're not native to that area. That's the thing that we have to realize is that their nativity is based very locally on the kind of place they evolved for, which was rocky, dry slopes. So like junipers, they've expanded all over the hill country because we overgrazed, denuded the hill country, and they spread out to all those areas, took advantage of the fact that there's a lot of open habitat for them to grow into because there's nothing else there. So when you look at the landscaping on that side of the town, if you try to put beautyberry over there on a high hill over on Rob Roy, it's probably not going to do very well. It's not going to perform very well. And you're going to wonder, well, what do I have to do to get it to grow? And the answer is get rid of it and plant evergreen sumac. Plant something that wouldn't be there normally. And that's what I tell people is if you have a chance, and this is something that this is the way I did it. There really isn't anybody to tell you anything about this. You have to go out and look. You have to look in the neighborhood of the place that you're working and say, where is an area here where it hasn't been terribly destroyed, that I can see what's actually there, what kind of trees are there. You can judge a lot by the trees. If you have live oaks, I can tell you right now that there's going to be limestone fairly close to the surface. Around here, this Quercus fusiformis, which is different than the coast live oak, always grows with limestone underneath it. In fact, if it doesn't, I've got a place where I used to live, there's a limestone outcropping, and then it drops off into some very thick clay. But the clay fills up this drop-off so it's almost level. So the live oaks grow up to that edge and then stop. And then it's hackberries, cedar elms, different plants that grow on clay. But you don't notice there's only about a foot difference in elevation, but one's limestone and one's clay. And so there's no live oaks out in the clay at all, nowhere. And on the other side, there's completely different vegetation. It's live oaks and some of the stuff that Elizabeth was talking about. There's viguera, there's frostweed, all those things in shallow rocky soil that you'd see on the west side of town. Then out in the field is stuff that you'd see on the east side of town over in Boggy Creek and some of those areas. And so that's instructive. You could say, well, if I plant a live oak here, I can get it to grow. The question is, do I want that to grow there, or should I pick a pecan, or should I pick a cedar elm, or should I pick a black walnut or something else that will actually do better there? Have less disease problems, have less drought problems, have all the advantages of a plant that is adapted for that environment. And that's really what it comes down to. And what you can do to sort of begin to learn that process is to look at where you are and see what's growing in those places and just copy it. That's all I ever do. Well, what's here? And then I just copy those things. Because I know that if they're doing well there, they'll do well over here because of the same kind of conditions. Other than that, you have to do what I did, is just spend a whole lot of time out looking around. But you can tell, like I said, you can tell a lot by looking at the trees. You're going to have fairly deep soil if you've got black walnuts. If you've got magnolias growing and they're doing well, it's going to be deep soil. You can grow magnolias around here if you got deep soil. You can grow Florida dogwoods around here if you got deep soil. If you got 6 feet of soil, those plants will do well without a lot of water and everything, as long as they don't hit the limestone. They grew up in Dallas natively. Same with, funny, I shouldn't encourage y'all, but the red maples do on that soil too. There's a place down by me where they built a church, and then they had to backfill the parking lot. And so the parking lot used to be sloped, but they flattened it out. So at one end there's 20 feet of fill, the other end there's 0. One end they planted, the deep fill areas, they planted sweet gums, and they planted them, in the knockouts in the parking lot, and they do progressively worse as the soil gets shallower. So the ones on the end are yellow with broken branches, and I don't know why they haven't pulled them out. They're just horrible, most looking. They look tortured. They look like Chernobyl trees. And then on the other end are these beautiful dark green sweet gums. And that's the difference, is that the other ones are touching the rock, and the ones down there, it's limey soil, it's limey water, but it's not limestone rock that it's growing on. And that can be the difference for some of these trees. So you have to know the area that you're building in or designing in. But if you do, and if you have a question, then the thing is to sort of spy out the neighborhood and see what's doing well in the other people's areas. And if you do that, you can sort of start building up a palette, like what grows where. You sort of build a mental picture, a map of what these areas look like and what they should be in there. Because otherwise, you're just going over lists. You're just going to go over lists and lists and lists and lists, and you're just going to your mind's going to get boggled after a while. And I've done that. I used to do that, and I would just, at a certain point, you just get overloaded with information. You couldn't make a decision. So it works a lot better if you just, I do that all the time. Hopefully there's a lot that they haven't built on. You look across there and go, oh, look, there's crode and fruticulosis. Well, that's a good one to do. There's grasses and, Setaria and, I'll see if I can find all these plants. I'll see if I can find Pavonia and, whatever's growing in those lots. So that is the easiest thing to do, is just copy. Because then you find out and you'll see the plants that are actually doing well in that locality. Is that it? You got 2 minutes for questions. That's right. Is there any questions? Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
First off, I appreciate your comment about Darwin and the competition aspect. Has been shown that not only has competition helped species evolve, but more so cooperation.
Cooperation is the part that is lacking, is that there's an element of cooperation in plants, a level of cooperation that you don't see that in sort of the evolutionary sciences of anything without roots. There is some there, but not as much as you see that in plants. In plants, there's a huge amount.
Absolutely. So I very much appreciate that comment. And also, in your talks about suppressing weeds and whatnot, all the proofs you said are very straight on, but in my experience, I've noticed that mulching or somewhat recreating the forest floor in a lot of cases by blanketing, what I think what you're doing in the Southwest, I think it's also very effective like that. Does that
If you're creating a forest, but if you're creating grasslands, that may be something different. So if exactly what you want to do in a forest is you want to recreate that forest soil. You want to create that forest activity. You want to encourage the soil organisms that would grow in those kind of situations. Those may not be the things that you'd want to do. Like we did a stuff in Galveston. Of course, you wouldn't want to do those on sand dunes. So what you have to do is that's actually been touted as sort of the end all be all, just solarize it or put a lot of mulch to suppress the weed. It doesn't work everywhere. Sometimes that's just what the weeds want. Certain kind of weeds like that when it's not in the right place. So luckily, we don't have a lot of like the central uplands where there's sand and gravel and you find those areas. If you go up the Colorado River, there's sandy areas. There's lote bush and South Texas looking places, and that probably wouldn't be the thing that you would do there. And I don't know what you do there, because those areas there's some wildlife management areas up there that are horrible with stickery, acacias and all kinds of things, and I don't know how you'd recover the sand dunes. Yeah. But not everybody here lives in the woodlands. I mean, a lot of this area would be grasslands. The problem is we plant trees and try to recreate a woodlands when we may be just, it may not want to be a woodlands. See, that's the problem that's the problem that we have in a park. We go, well, we want shade, we want play areas. Which is it? We're going to create a forest or we're going to create a savanna? We try to do both because that's what our use is for. The plants aren't going to cooperate. So it's always going to be a sort of a maintenance problem to maintain those. Any more? I answered them all. Excellent. I did it again. All the questions are answered.
Thank you. Yeah, if you want to talk some more, he's really shy and he probably wouldn't want to talk to you about that stuff. So he'll be around for a few more minutes if you have some specific questions. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. I want to note we're really close to being on time. And our next landscape professional training is on June 23rd. It's going to be water quality. We're going to talk more about water quality controls, the actual green infrastructure, and then some integrated pest management, pest stuff. Woo! So thanks. Please put your evaluations out on the table. The TNLA CEU and the ISA CEU signups are out there on the table as well. So thank you.